Hello everyone and welcome back to Rebel Eaters Club with commentary. We are covering the last major episode. I believe this is episode 6, which is Food is Life with Lei Ho, one of those. So this is the last video that's going to be split up into 2 parts. We have 2 more videos after this for bonus podcast episodes that she put out, but they're not as long, so we're just going to cover those all in one go. But this is the last 2-parter, and let's just get into it.
Hey everyone, Vergie here. I just wanted to let you know that I might sound a little different in this episode. We recorded this one in my bedroom, where I'm sheltering in place. I also wanted to note, in this episode, we're talking about the role restaurants play in our relationship to food. I think it's really important to acknowledge the hard time folks who work in the food and beverage industry are having right now. If you are able, check out the link in the show notes. It's a good list of organizations helping restaurants, workers, and farmers in this tough time. If you have the ability, consider donating. Here's the show. Growing up, I really dreaded Sunday mornings. It was church day, and church day meant the following. Number 1, having to wear pantyhose that chafed my inner thighs and made them red hot and bumpy. Number 2, having to listen to grown-ups talk for hours on end about stuff that didn't make any sense. Number 3, sitting still while the pastor gave a sermon. He was the most boring grown-up of them all. And number 4, all this while having access to literally 0 snacks. The only thing that redeemed Sundays was Red Lobster. Because when church was finally over, my grandfather would pile all of us into the dark blue station wagon, the one with little silver specks in the paint. My grandfather was the breadwinner of the family. He had been a bodybuilder in his 20s and was still pumping iron 3 or 4 times a week even then, well into his 50s. He was the head chemist at a factory, a union job. He worked long hours with other men who were big and strong like him. I remember how he'd puff out his chest when we rolled up into Red Lobster for lunch. He'd grown up super poor, and the idea of being able to pay for 7 people's worth of seafood was a big fucking deal. My grandmother loved being the fancy lady at his side, who never had to reach for her purse when my grandpa was around. She would do her hair up in curlers on Saturday night and pick out her special Sunday outfit. Yes, it was for the church people, but really, it was in case we ran into anyone she knew at Red Lobster, so she could show off her family, well-fed and well-dressed. For my grandma and grandpa, being able to go out to eat meant something really special and really specific. It meant making it. In the best damn country in the world as far as they were concerned. They had come to this country with only $2 in their pockets, and there they were, eating crab melts. They were giving their family something better than they had growing up. For that 2 or 3 hours at Red Lobster, because trust me, we stretched out lunch. We could leave all our troubles at home and laugh and eat until we were stuffed and alive with the American dream. I'm Vergie Tovar.
It's a little unfortunate that, don't get me wrong, so far, I don't have anything to really say about this little anecdote. This, we have the American dream with our, stomachs. I'm not saying that I don't get the point that she's making, but it, again, because this is a regular thing that we see with Richie, it's like she is equating all success with eating. It's not that her father was able to get a good union job. It wasn't even that, I understand that concept of making it and being able to pay for 7 family members to eat out at a restaurant and how that's a big deal, and I completely get that. But there's this, that's her major example of success, not the fact that whatever that car she had, I don't know, it sounds like they were doing fairly well financially. 7 people on, the primary breadwinner's budget, which is huge. That's incredible. And, I don't know, there's just something, there's more to success than just the food. And I feel like Vergie is overly concentrating, on the food part of it. But that's just my perspective.
And this is Rebel Eaters Club. We've talked a lot about the private and intimate side of food, but my guest today will walk us from the intimacy of home to the public domain, where food takes on yet another dimension. So Lei Ho is the restaurant critic at the San Francisco Chronicle.
I'm delighted that I even got to choose a snack. That's such an upgrade from the usual.
She's taught me that when it comes to eating out, there's way more to it than meets the eye.
So Lei, do you want to tell us the snack that you chose? Right in front of us is a yellow package of sake ika, which is prepared shredded squid. You often find this in Asian grocery stores, and this was the snack that I would always gravitate to when I was a kid and we were going grocery shopping. I would grab it and just throw it in the shopping cart without asking.
Yes.
So to this day, I love it. It's just squid jerky, sometimes cuttlefish jerky, sometimes spicy, sometimes not, but it just tastes like really sweet and savory and salty, and it's so chewy. You really have to work on it.
Yeah. Do you want to do the honors?
Okay. So, and there's like a bloom of just fermented squid smell that flies out at you once you open the bag. It's so perfect. I put way too much in my mouth just now because I was so excited.
Yeah, it's got that, like that taste of the sea.
And it's so umami. It just makes you salivate, you know. Thank you for bringing this for me.
Thank you for opening up the package. It was so beautiful and it's delicious. Okay, so we can keep snacking on this delicious, stringy, bloomy, aromatic treat. In the meanwhile, though, I need to know, who are you? Who you are? Who is Soleil?
Sure. I am a restaurant critic. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I work for the San Francisco Chronicle. I started the job about a year ago, so I'm fairly new to the restaurant critic world. But previously I had a podcast called Racist Sandwich, which was all about how food intersected with race and class and gender. And I was a freelance writer. I would do things once in a while as befit my mood. But my main gig was cooking and working in the restaurant world.
I'm going to ask you about a million questions. I remember someone I was dating brought it up. We were driving somewhere and he was like, oh, did you hear that there's this new restaurant critic for the Chronicle?
Oh, funny.
And she really made a splash, and she sort of a little bit talked about how she wasn't interested in reviewing and revering places like Chez Panisse. And it's just like, and he was like, I think it's right up your alley. And it was just one of those things where like, we had this 30-minute conversation about that. This is when you know you've succeeded, when like people can have a 30-minute conversation about something that you did through hearsay and it's stimulating. So can you talk about that? Like what is your day-to-day life like as a restaurant critic?
I read a lot of Yelp, which is funny because, I'm not supposed to write Yelp reviews, basically, because that's not the style that I do. But it is interesting to me to see what's coming up, what's interesting, like what's new. A lot of research because there are more than 7,000 restaurants in San Francisco alone, right?
Wow.
And there are 365 days in a year. So I really need to choose wisely what's happening here. Often when I go out, it's for dinner. And so I'm probably going out to eat maybe like 5 times a week, minimum. And I usually, if I have to make reservations, I'll make it under a fake name. The anonymity part is just for me to help workers be a little less stressed, at least in the lead up, and just to help me avoid some awkwardness because it gets awkward sometimes.
Can I ask about your methodology as a restaurant critic?
Sure. So when I started the job, I was always criticizing the food media from the outside. I was always talking about how, like even for something that is so light as a genre, people don't really take it seriously. It can still perpetuate colonial ideas, like fat shaming ideas. Like there are really serious things that we engage with through food media, even if we don't acknowledge it, right? Through othering of other people's cuisines, through talking about food in gendered ways, like all kinds of really below the waves kind of stuff. And so when I got this job, which was very unlikely to me that I got this job, but I did, I realized, okay, here's my chance. I have a much bigger platform. Here's a chance to really engage with those things that I was so worried about and worked up about when I was on the outside. And here's how to put it in practice, right? So how do you write about food and restaurants in a way that acknowledges that there are more than 2 genders, for instance? How do you write about restaurants in a way that doesn't otherize people who didn't?
Okay, I'm sorry, she lost me at the how do you talk about food in ways that there are more than 2 genders? What does gender identity have anything to do with food? Like, I'm not, again, when she was talking about it, I was thinking that she was just more interested in reviewing and uplifting like mom and pop shops of, cultural minorities or something, in which case, yeah, I totally get that. There's plenty of places that are just completely overlooked because it's not like in vogue or it doesn't have this really upscale feel to it or anything, but there's like some really good food to be had from these little mom and pop shop places. Like, I totally get that. There's a few in my city that I frequent regularly because their food is fucking awesome. But she's lost me here with the talking about being like a restaurant critic and talking about food in ways that like acknowledge that there's more than 2 genders. I'm all for like LGBT activism, that sort of thing, but this seems completely unrelated to restaurant review work. Like, I am confusion because I don't understand how it, at that point, to me, if you're trying to slip in the conversation of there's more than 2 genders, it does just seem like you're kind of shoehorning a topic in that doesn't really belong there. Like, if you want to, unless maybe you're talking about the bathroom situation, like if the, criticizing the restaurant for only having men's and women's bathrooms, I guess, would be a way to... That seems a little nitpicky to me, but whatever. Like, I don't really understand fully why some of these unrelated topics would be put in. Like, if you want to go into cultural stuff based on food and maybe focus on types of cuisines that have largely been ignored, I totally get that. But there's part of this I'm not really understanding.
Didn't grow up eating mashed potatoes.
Right.
You know what I mean? The LA Times' food critic, Patricia Escarcega, just released a newsletter about how the LA Times food section will no longer italicize foreign words. And she used foreign in quotes. She's of Mexican descent. And so she was talking a lot about like who is being made to feel foreign just so you can italicize words because it's your style or whatever. And I thought that was really interesting. When I first started the job, I wrote a whole list of words that I wasn't going to use, in my writing.
Can I ask what they are?
Yeah, it was a little indulgent, but I wanted to also introduce myself, because I was kind of an unknown quantity for a lot of people who subscribe to the Chronicle. The words included things like ethnic, for instance, like what is ethnic cuisine? What do you imagine? Do you imagine a French bistro or Spanish tapas? Or do you imagine Indonesian food or Indian food? Like crack, I don't use that phrase. Addictive, I don't use that phrase. Guilt, I don't use any sort of language of guilt when I talk about food.
Oh, yes.
Basic, right? But we get pitched on it all the time, right? As like writers, the guilt-free pasta for summer 2020.
Right.
All of that stuff. It's just, no.
I was reading the piece that you did on the SF restaurant La Coloniale. Am I saying that correctly?
I don't know. We're not French. Who cares?
Yes. Oh my God. I always, in my regular life, I intentionally consistently mess up French. Like I'll say frites instead of frites. Anywho, whatever. Anyway, all that to say, in the piece, you're kind of talking about these restaurants that are romanticizing eras that are in fact very violent. And the allure of the restaurant from the person who is dining is that you are the person in power in that experience.
Right. Yeah. I think a good place to start.
I'm sorry. Like I'm interested in hearing their actual examples first, but I think this villainizing of aesthetics, just because someone, like, they're recreating the general feel of, let's say, the 1920s, just because they're recreating that aesthetic feel doesn't mean they're endorsing everything that happened in the 1920s and the social issues that were still in your face terrible at the time. I don't think that someone wanting to do a flapper style restaurant where they play swing music and everyone all of the workers are dressed in that sort of 1920s style. I don't think that that's like someone's going to that restaurant to feel like they are in a position of power because of the social issues at that time in history. Sometimes, like, I really love Victorian style media, Victorian style many things. Even, like, I've been really into The Ancient Magus Bride lately, and it takes place in modern day, but it has this very distinct, like, a Japanese interpretation of a Victorian Gothic story. I love it, but that doesn't, just because I love the, like, Victorian Gothic, because I like a lot of Victorian Gothic literature as well, that doesn't mean that I'm like, it doesn't mean I want to live in that time period, but let's say that I wanted to live in that time period for aesthetic reasons, because we all hear this, the wrong generation shit of people that aren't really, the issue is that people aren't really thinking about, like, the societal implications of those time periods. They're thinking about the aesthetic. They're thinking about what was, like, popular at the time in fashion and sometimes food or music or that sort of thing. They're thinking about the very surface level representation of those time periods. And I don't think that that's wrong to have a deep appreciation for it. I think saying that you were born in the wrong generation and you should have been born in this time period is a little ignorant and short-sighted, but if you take it for the most of the time, the offhanded comment that it is, I don't think that it's inherently problematic. I think it's an appreciation and a love for the aesthetics of the time.
To start is thinking about, in any context, who is doing the serving and who's being served, and in what ways are those demographics, whatever, normalized, and in what way are they normalizing hierarchies that are present in that context, right? So when I think about a restaurant like Le Colonial, which is essentially cosplaying French colonial Indochina, which is what they called Indochina, like Vietnam and Cambodia, the glory days before the revolution, before the uprising, before the French got kicked out.
Yeah.
Place you're prompted to take on the positionality of the colonizer.
Right.
You are in a place that is kind of rustic, lots of mahogany everywhere. The people serving you are mainly people of color. The furniture is of that era, and it's just this moment of peace where everything is so secure, locked in, before everything's upended.
I'm curious though, because she said, maybe I missed it when I paused it. Is she talking about a very specific restaurant? Because if they like purposely did it to where people of color are the ones that are serving you, then yeah, that's a little weird. But given how we've seen Vergie and the people on the Rebel Eaters Club, I can't help but wonder if this is more of a hypothetical situation, two, if this is an embellished recounting. Were they all people of color, or were there a number of people of color in as workers, but there were also white people working too? Like, I'm just, I don't know. There's just something about this that, again, it's kind of like that, what we heard, what was it? Was it the last episode, or was it the episode before that, when they go into saying that, like, saying food is healthy or something is racist because food from cultures of primarily people of color are what, like, Westerners view as unhealthy. Or it was some stupid fucking argument. It was some really fucking dumb argument that I remember even responding to, because it was just so dumb and it ignored so much. And I kind of feel like that's what's going on here. There's so much more than the surface level that I feel like they take the surface level of the situation and then they overanalyze it and twist it to assert their narrative. And I feel like it's a way of taking food and bringing it into the other isms, primarily racism. Like, I feel like it's a way of, they're twisting it in this way to eventually loop back around to, like, fat phobia and fat activism as a way of legitimizing the whole thing.
Ended by revolution and war. And to me, that's so troubling. Pleasure is really troubling. And maybe that has a lot to do with me and my shit. But anytime I feel like you are asked to, or you're lulled into this sense of complacency,
right,
of just accepting stimuli, I feel suspicious, because that's when you're the most susceptible to ideology. And restaurants are that place for a lot of people, where our senses of gender are reinforced, right? Like, there are many restaurants still to this day where women, if they are in mixed company, they receive menus that don't have prices on them. And so many people realize, their bodies don't fit the restaurant either, the chairs or the...
Okay, so that bit about, like, the women don't have the menus with prices on them, where is that happening exactly? I'm very curious. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just, like, this has to be somewhat of an upscale restaurant for this to be happening. Most, well, definitely chain restaurants don't do this. Most, like, mom and pop type shops don't do this. It's more akin to, like, a fast food situation where, like, there's a menu up. You look at it, you order, all of the prices are there, and sometimes, if you're lucky, nutritional information is on that menu too. So I'm just kind of curious. And that bit about fat people, like, their bodies aren't accepted there because they can't fit in the seats. Most of it is, it's not like the restaurant is choosing specifically smaller seating in most cases. Like, there might be one or two restaurants that are like, we only want to serve certain clientele. We only want to serve the most chic clientele. And that's, like, fine, whatever. It's weird. And it doesn't feel conducive to making money, quite frankly. But if it's backed by a wealthy owner and they want to keep a certain aesthetic, that wouldn't surprise me if that happened. By and large, though, most of people are just ordering general chairs. It's not about specifically saying fat people aren't allowed here. If the fat people can't fit in the chairs, then chances are they are super morbidly obese. And it becomes more of an issue of, you are so far outside the normal that expecting the entire restaurant to pay for these super reinforced chairs, these super wide chairs, is cost prohibitive.
The floor plan or whatever, and they're treated like furniture. So they're not only places of pleasure, but they're also places where who gets to feel pleasure. There are assumptions based on who they are, like what you bring to the place. So, they're not ideologically empty places, restaurants. For many people with power, pleasure is derived from hierarchy, and it's derived from people being in the places that they're supposed to be. And sometimes that means not in your presence.
Yes. Whoa. I'm just letting that.
I think that's true for some people. Some people do get off, quite frankly, on this feeling of having power over others. And sometimes, and I would even say there is a level of pleasure to that, but it's not. It's kind of like that bit on everyday sadism and troll comments on YouTube, where the people can typically function perfectly fine otherwise, but then they go online and they enact moments of cruelty or just complete disregard for another person, and they'll type these comments out because they get some level of pleasure from spitting out caustic shit at people online. And it's kind of like the benign sadism concept. I don't remember it that well. It was a video I watched a long time ago. I can't even tell you what it was, what channel it was from, what the name of the video was. I just remember this because I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I think that level of everyday sadism also kind of flows into Karens, because I think to a certain extent Karens get off on that feeling of power for asking for the manager, that they are the customer, that they are exacting some level of control over this minimum wage worker. So I get that point. I do. But I don't know about it being an entire, from the way this is being described here, like an entire business model centered on this concept. It's a possibility, but I don't think everyone that sees this, oh, this is whatever stage of social development or industry development restaurant, we'll even go with just like a Victorian themed restaurant, because that's what I know. Let's say you go into a Victorian themed restaurant for high tea. It's not that you want to be in that position of power and being served. It's this sense of like this feeling that you're living just a brief moment in history, but it's a complete facade, and most people going into it realize that it's just a complete facade, and it's just something to have fun with. Sometimes, especially if it's a Victorian themed restaurant and they center on like high tea, then chances are they have very high quality tea and they have higher quality items, so that could also lend to the experience and why people go there. It's not necessarily this feeling of wanting to be served. I don't know. There's just something, I think if you're turning, because if you go into that feeling of wanting to be served and being in this position of power, then you can say that, which may be her point, that you can say that any restaurant that has servers functions into that fantasy, which is a possibility. Like, I think that was what the original point of some restaurants were for people that wouldn't normally be able to afford personal chefs to get that feeling of being waited on. But I think that that's not inherently connected to a racial element. And I don't think it's become so ingrained in our culture. I don't think it has that novelty of I'm being waited on and that feeling of like this super rich or something, like you're getting a peek into what it would be like to be super rich. I don't think that it holds that same level of novelty anymore. Most people, like most of us, have gone out to even just chain restaurants when we were kids. It's somewhat normal, and that's how we also learn about like tipping culture in the US, was you watched your parents calculate the tip and that sort of thing. Now most of the apps will do it for us, but I don't know. I feel like there's a little bit of a reach here.
Thing that soak in. Yes.
On the other hand, recently I went to a restaurant in the Mission for the first time called Prubetsu, which is chamorro for bon appetit, essentially. And it is a Guamanian restaurant. And the chefs are really clear about how colonialism informs the food that they serve. Because Guam, has been colonized, taken over, whatever, occupied by the U.S., the Spanish, Japanese, and had a lot of influence from the Philippines and China as well. So the food that they make, the chamorro, like the indigenous people, is very much, full of spam and like Chinese vegetables and like sausages and like all kinds of things from all of these people.
Yes.
Vietnamese food is a similar thing. Filipino food is a very, very similar thing. Indigenous American food is similar. It has a lot of those sorts of, like with fry bread, those hallmarks of this is what we received and this is what we're going to do with it. This is how we survive. So in that way, I find those stories so empowering and so interesting, that even when you are in this kind of culture that is treating you as something to be trampled underfoot, you will still find ways to make something beautiful and sustaining and fulfilling for you and your family or your loved ones. And in that way, you can, even under conditions of extreme duress, like create something amazing. And I just love that. So for me, every article that I write or every review is an opportunity to really think about that and wrestle with that and try to change things just slightly. And that's the sphere that I can influence.
Yes.
As a food writer, I can't influence everything and everyone all at once. But if I can change this little thing, I can maybe die happy.
So Lei is a radical presence in the food media world for a lot of reasons. For one, she shifts the perspective of the critic. There's this concept I first learned about in graduate school. It's called positionality. It's the acknowledgement that who you are influences how you think. Food media has for a long time been dominated by wealthy white men's voices. As a result, we've been taught to think about food the way they think about food, as if their positionality is the default way of seeing the world. But most of us aren't wealthy white men, and acknowledging that frees us up to see that every single dish has a history and a context.
I think there is a level of truth in that statement, but like this whole thing of, restaurants were primarily written by rich white men. Definitely, even 30 years ago, that was probably the case. But with stuff like Yelp and Google reviews and stuff, that's not really the case anymore. Like, I don't read magazine or newspaper restaurant reviews. I go on Yelp. I go on Google reviews, which has anyone that has gone to those restaurants, regardless of race. Most of the time, you don't even think about the race of the person writing. You just read their experiences. It becomes more anonymous for the reviewers, I think. And I feel like you get a more holistic view overall. So I'm not saying that there isn't a level of truth to what they're saying, but I think they're still looking at this as if the internet doesn't exist. They're still looking at this as if we can't go on their restaurant's website and take a look at what they offer, take a look at the food that they offer, take a look at the Yelp reviews of what they got for not only service but food quality. Same with Google reviews, and we've have this whole media series on looking at restaurants and seeing that sometimes restaurants have, for me it's kitchen nightmares. I love the occasional kitchen nightmares episode when I just want to kind of veg for a little bit. But you see how some places that may tout themselves as higher quality or something have like really disgusting kitchens in the back. So it becomes a little more reliant, and I think that it's even more accurate to rely on Yelp and Google reviews. I mean, good for her for being a restaurant critic. That's fantastic. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that still read like actual restaurant critics and stuff. If I'm looking to spend money and I'm looking for like the average Joe Schmo experience, which is what I look for when I'm looking at new places, I'm going to look at Yelp and Google reviews.
Context, and that those things matter. That seems pretty obvious to me, but that simple acknowledgement is immediately seen as political. And what Soleil is doing, writing about how colonialism has affected Guamanian food, for example, makes some people feel very uncomfortable. More on that after the break.
Now, we're not quite at halfway, but I learned from the last episode that stopping at the halfway point is really the easiest place to stop and then pick up next time. So we're just going to go ahead and leave it here. I kind of feel like I've been a little all over the place with this. It's just, these episodes become harder and harder to comment on because they are trying so hard to blend concepts of fat acceptance, fat phobia, and they're blending it in with for some, and again, even with gender with this, feels out of place. But they're also bringing in largely colonialism, racism, and more highly sensitive topics. They blend it in so well that it's harder to criticize it, which I think is the point. I think because they realize that racism, it's, if someone's talking about structural racism, structural like colonialism of how these places were affected, then then you slip in something about fat phobia or stuff, it becomes a lot harder to criticize it because it's blended in with those things. So it seems like you're criticizing the concept of racism and colonialism in favor of those things when you're not. So this just seems highly manipulative, and we'll finish this episode up next time. There will be no Wednesday video this week. I'm going to do just another very large video for Fat Dr. UK. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about a couple of just life update things here. Real quick, 1, maintained this week, same thing. 2, another reason why there's only 2 videos this week is I go back to work this week. School starts up for the kids. And so I'm not going to have a huge amount of... Well, I'm going to have time because I'm still only working part-time, but I'm signing up to be at least a substitute teacher, so that way I can kind of get a feel for a variety of positions and see if there's anything else I would be interested in. And as for creativity, I tried out leather crafting for the first time. It turned out really shitty, but I enjoyed it. I just need a better workspace, so that's on hold right now until I can cultivate a better workspace for that. I've been reading a shit ton of manga. I am up through volume 10 of The Ancient Magus Bride, and I fucking love it. I have grown to love Elias even more. And that's about it. I'm just kind of chugging along and preparing to go back to work for the new school year. So that's all I really have to say today. Sorry it wasn't that interesting of a video. It's really become hard to comment on this because I feel sometimes like I'm commenting on the racial aspect, and sometimes I am, but it's just kind of difficult because they're tying food and stuff into racism and stuff, and it's kind of hard to piece it apart and get my point across. But anyway, I'm going to leave that here for today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.